The resurrection of Christ remains the defining event of Christian history. Yet filmmaker Mel Gibson has suggested that it may also be the moment humanity has never fully seen or understood. According to his perspective, the resurrection has often been portrayed as peaceful and reverent in art, sermons, and cinema. But he believes the reality of that moment may have been far more overwhelming. Something intense, supernatural, and powerful enough to shake the very fabric of existence. Behind the stone-sealed tomb, something unfolded that history has rarely attempted to describe in detail. Not because it lacks significance, but because its magnitude may have been too extraordinary to capture in human storytelling. The resurrection was not simply a gentle awakening. It was a dramatic confrontation between life and death itself. It was a moment when unseen spiritual realities collided in ways no artist or filmmaker has fully portrayed. So what truly took place in those hidden hours before the stone was rolled away? Before witnesses arrived? Before the world realized the tomb was empty? And why has a deeper portrayal of this event remained largely unexplored for centuries? Stay with us as we journey into the resurrection story from a perspective rarely presented. If this story moves you, consider supporting the video with a like, sharing your reflections in the comments, and subscribing to the channel. Thank you for walking this journey with us. The morning began with noise, anger, and movement. Jerusalem was crowded with pilgrims who had traveled long distances for the Passover festival. Streets that normally carried the rhythm of merchants and prayers now carried something heavier. Word had spread quickly that 3 men were being led outside the city to be executed. Roman soldiers pushed through the crowd with disciplined precision. Between them walked a man already weakened by violence. His name had once stirred crowds, drawn fishermen from their nets, and brought the sick to their knees with hope. Now, Jesus of Nazareth struggled beneath the weight of a wooden crossbeam pressed across his torn shoulders. The soldiers were impatient. They had carried out countless executions before. To them, crucifixion was not cruelty, it was control. It was Rome's way of ending rebellion before it could grow. And yet something about the man they were escorting created a strange tension among the crowd. Some shouted insults, others wept openly. Many simply watched, unable to look away. Jesus stumbled repeatedly as they moved through the narrow streets. The scourging he had endured had stripped flesh from his back. Blood had dried and cracked across his skin. Each fall forced the soldiers to drag him upright again. When it became clear he could not carry the cross any farther, they seized a passerby named Simon from Cyrene and forced him to carry it the rest of the way. The procession finally reached the hill called Golgotha, a barren rise of rock outside the city walls. The name meant Place of the Skull, a location chosen for visibility. Rome wanted executions to be seen. Fear was part of the punishment. The soldiers worked with efficiency that came from routine. They stripped Jesus of his garments and forced him onto the wood. The hammer blows that drove iron through his wrists echoed across the hill. His feet were fastened next, securing him to the cross before it was lifted upright and dropped into a hole carved into the rock. The impact sent a shock through his body. 2 criminals were crucified beside him, one on each side. Above Jesus' head, a wooden plaque carried an inscription ordered by the Roman governor. It read simply, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." The title was meant as mockery, but it would remain there for the entire city to read. Crowds gathered below. Some had once followed him from village to village, listening to his teachings. Others had only heard rumors of miracles and controversy. Religious leaders stood among them, shaking their heads, convinced that the threat he represented had finally been silenced. Soldiers cast lots for his clothing, treating the moment as another ordinary duty. As the hours passed, the sun climbed high over Jerusalem. Then, without warning, the light began to fade. The sky dimmed into an unnatural darkness that spread across the land. It was not sunset, it was midday. The crowd grew quiet, uneasy, uncertain whether what they were witnessing was coincidence or something far beyond their understanding. On the cross, Jesus struggled to breathe. Crucifixion killed slowly, forcing victims to push against nailed limbs just to inhale. Each breath brought fresh waves of pain. Yet instead of cursing his executioners, Jesus spoke words of forgiveness. He asked that those who condemned him be forgiven because they did not fully understand what they were doing. Below the cross stood a small group who refused to leave. Among them was his mother, Mary, her face strained by grief she could not express aloud. Beside her stood John, one of Jesus' closest followers. Jesus saw them and entrusted them to one another's care. ensuring that his mother would not be left alone. Hours stretched into silence, broken only by the wind and occasional mocking voices from those who demanded he prove his power by saving himself. He did not respond to them. The darkness deepened as if the world itself had drawn breath and refused to release it. Finally, Jesus spoke again. His voice was weak but clear. He entrusted his spirit to the Father and then fell still. At that moment, the ground beneath Golgotha began to shake. The tremor spread through the city. Stones cracked apart. Far inside the temple, the heavy curtain that separated the most sacred space from the rest of the sanctuary tore violently from top to bottom. Priests froze in shock as the barrier that had stood for generations fell open in seconds. A Roman centurion supervising the execution watched the sky, the trembling earth, and the man who had just died. He had overseen countless crucifixions, yet something about this death unsettled him deeply. Without fully understanding why, he whispered aloud that the man on the cross was truly the Son of God. To confirm death beyond doubt, a soldier drove a spear into Jesus' side. No movement followed. Blood and water flowed from the wound. The execution was complete. The crowd began to disperse. Some left shaken, others left satisfied. The disciples who had once walked openly beside Jesus disappeared into the city, afraid they would soon be arrested. By evening, Golgotha stood nearly empty. 3 crosses silhouetted against the darkening sky. Time was running short. Jewish law required bodies to be buried before the Sabbath began at sunset. A respected council member named Joseph of Arimathea made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. Though he had kept his support for Jesus private, he now stepped forward publicly and went directly to Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, to request permission to take the body. Pilate was surprised that death had come so quickly. He summoned the centurion for confirmation. Only after verifying the execution did he grant Joseph's request. Another man joined Joseph, Nicodemus, a Pharisee who had once visited Jesus secretly at night to ask questions about his teachings. Nicodemus brought burial spices in extraordinary quantity, an amount normally reserved for royal funerals. Together, they approached the cross with careful urgency. Removing the body was slow and painful work. Nails were pulled free from flesh and wood. The body was lowered gently into waiting arms. The crowd had mostly vanished, leaving only a few faithful followers and grieving women watching in silence. They carried Jesus' body to a nearby garden where Joseph owned a newly carved tomb cut directly into the rock. It had never been used before. They wrapped the body in linen cloths mixed with burial spices, following Jewish burial customs as quickly as possible before darkness fell. When the preparation was finished, they laid him inside the tomb. A large circular stone was rolled across the entrance, sealing it completely. The sound of stone grinding against rock echoed through the garden like the closing of a chapter no one wanted to accept. But the religious leaders were not satisfied. They remembered Jesus' words that he would rise again after 3 days. They did not believe those words, but they feared his followers might use them to create a dangerous rumor. They returned to Pilate and requested security. Roman soldiers were stationed at the tomb. The stone was marked with an official imperial seal. Breaking that seal would be considered an act of rebellion against Rome itself. By nightfall, the tomb was guarded, sealed, and silent. Jerusalem prepared for the Sabbath. Lamps were lit in homes. Prayers were spoken. The city moved forward as though the story had ended exactly where Rome intended it to end. But beneath the stillness of the sealed tomb, history itself was waiting to turn. Jerusalem awoke the next morning beneath a strange stillness. The Sabbath had begun, and by tradition, the city slowed into quiet observance. Markets closed. Fires burned low in homes. Families gathered for prayer and rest. From the outside, it was a normal Sabbath, but nothing inside the hearts of Jesus' followers felt normal. The memory of the crucifixion hung over the city like smoke that refused to lift. Only hours earlier, crowds had shouted, soldiers had hammered iron, and the earth itself had trembled. Now, the streets moved with routine, as though the violence of the previous day had already been absorbed into history. Outside the city walls, in a garden near Golgotha, the tomb remained sealed. The heavy stone sat firmly in place, pressed against the entrance with unmovable weight. The Roman seal marked its surface, a symbol of imperial authority that warned against tampering. Guards stood watch, shifting their stance in quiet rotation, their armor catching faint light from the early morning sky. To them, the assignment was simple: ensure the body stayed where it had been placed, prevent interference, prevent rumor. Rome dealt harshly with soldiers who failed their duty, and these men had no intention of becoming examples. Inside the tomb, everything was still. The body of Jesus lay wrapped in linen cloths, the burial spices pressed carefully between the folds. The garden outside held the quiet sounds of wind moving through branches and distant city noise softened by stone and distance. To every human observer, death had completed its work. Across Jerusalem, the disciples struggled to understand what had happened. Only days earlier, they had walked with a man they believed would restore Israel, challenge corruption, and reveal the kingdom of God in visible power. They had watched him heal diseases that physicians could not touch. They had seen storms obey his voice. They had heard him speak with authority that unsettled religious leaders and comforted the broken. Now he was gone. Fear moved through them like cold air through an open door. They gathered behind locked doors, speaking in whispers, expecting that soldiers or temple guards might arrive at any moment. The same authorities who had condemned Jesus could easily decide his followers were a threat that needed to be removed. Peter sat in silence longer than most. The memory of denying Jesus still burned in his mind. Only hours before the crucifixion, he had sworn loyalty. Then fear had overtaken him, and he had denied even knowing the man he once called master. The weight of that failure pressed heavier now that there seemed to be no chance to ask forgiveness. Mary Magdalene remained surrounded by grief that felt deeper than language. She had watched the crucifixion from a distance, unable to intervene, unable to help, unable to stop the violence. The memory of his voice, the calm certainty in his words, echoed through her thoughts, clashing with the final image she had seen on the cross. Others sat in stunned disbelief, replaying moments when Jesus had spoken about suffering, about betrayal, about rising again. Those words now felt distant and confusing. None of them fully understood what he meant. To them, resurrection sounded impossible, more symbolic than literal. Death was final. Everyone knew that. Meanwhile, the religious leaders who had pushed for the execution rested with cautious satisfaction. The public threat had been removed. The crowds that once followed Jesus had scattered, yet a quiet unease remained. They remembered his words about returning after 3 days. They did not believe them, but they feared what his followers might claim if the body disappeared. The guards outside the tomb offered reassurance. For the people of Jerusalem, life resumed its religious rhythm. Prayers were spoken in homes and synagogues. Sacred readings were recited. Families shared Sabbath meals. But inside the temple, something remained unsettled. The torn veil still hung open. The massive curtain that had separated the Holy of Holies from the rest of the sanctuary had been ripped apart during the crucifixion. No official repair had been completed. Priests moved carefully around it, uncertain whether to treat it as damage or as a sign. Its presence unsettled them. It stood as a silent reminder that the previous day had fractured something deeper than political order. As daylight faded into evening, Jerusalem remained wrapped in quiet observance. Lamps glowed in windows. Conversations softened. The city moved through ritual, unaware that history itself seemed to be holding its breath. For Jesus' followers, time felt suspended. They did not yet know that their despair rested inside a larger story still unfolding. To them, this Sabbath was not sacred rest. It was emotional collapse. The future they imagined had disappeared, replaced by fear and unanswered questions. The tomb remained sealed. The guards remained vigilant. The disciples remained hidden. Nothing moved. Yet beneath that stillness, something unseen pressed toward completion. The night deepened, and the garden surrounding the tomb grew darker. The guards shifted positions, exchanging quiet words to stay awake. Roman training demanded alertness, but even disciplined soldiers could not fully shake the unease that came with guarding the body of a man whose death had shaken the ground itself. Hours passed slowly. Wind stirred branches overhead. Leaves scraped softly against stone. The city lights dimmed as Jerusalem settled into sleep. The tomb remained silent, holding its secret behind rock and seal. For those who loved Jesus, the silence felt unbearable. It seemed to confirm that death had spoken the final word. Their memories felt like fragile threads connecting them to a future that no longer existed. Every promise he had spoken now hovered between hope and confusion. The world had not ended. Rome still ruled. The temple still stood. Jerusalem still prayed. But for those who had followed Jesus, meaning itself felt fractured. Saturday passed without miracle. No crowds gathered at the tomb. No voices proclaimed hope. No sign appeared to suggest that anything had changed. The sealed stone stood as a symbol of finality, watched by soldiers who trusted in iron discipline and imperial law. Night fell again. Darkness wrapped around the city, quiet and heavy. Somewhere behind locked doors, followers of Jesus whispered prayers they barely believed would be answered. Somewhere in the temple courts, priests continued rituals that had guided generations. Somewhere outside the walls, Roman soldiers guarded a grave that to them represented the end of another rebellion. But the stillness was deceptive, because history does not always move in noise and spectacle. Sometimes it moves in hidden moments where no witness stands, where no voice records what is unfolding. And while Jerusalem slept, the sealed tomb waited in silence for a dawn no one was prepared to see. The third morning began quietly. Jerusalem still slept beneath the fading darkness of night. The Sabbath had ended only hours earlier, and the city rested in the fragile calm that follows grief and exhaustion. The streets were nearly empty, washed in pale gray light as dawn slowly approached. Outside the city walls, a cool breeze moved through the garden where the tomb stood. The Roman guards remained stationed beside the sealed stone, shifting their weight to stay alert as the long night stretched toward sunrise. Their orders were simple and absolute. The tomb was not to be opened. The body was not to be disturbed. They expected another quiet morning, but before the sun rose above the horizon, the ground beneath the garden began to tremble. It started as a faint vibration, subtle enough to be mistaken for shifting stone. Then the trembling intensified. The earth shook with sudden force, sending dust falling from rock surfaces and branches rattling violently overhead. The guards staggered, struggling to keep their footing as the ground moved beneath them. Through the trembling air, a presence descended into the garden, sudden, overwhelming, and impossible to ignore. Light filled the darkness with a brilliance that did not come from the rising sun. The stone covering the tomb shifted violently, then rolled aside with unstoppable force. The guards froze. Men trained to remain steady in the chaos of battle collapsed in terror, their strength replaced by paralysis as the light engulfed the entrance to the tomb. Fear overwhelmed discipline. The scene unfolding before them defied everything they had been trained to trust. And then, just as suddenly as the earthquake began, the garden fell still again. The stone stood displaced, the tomb stood open. Inside, the burial place no longer held a body. At nearly the same moment, while the city remained unaware of what had happened, a small group of women walked toward the garden carrying spices and burial oils. Among them was Mary Magdalene, her thoughts consumed by grief that had not lifted since the crucifixion. She had come to finish the burial preparations that had been rushed before the Sabbath began. As they approached, they spoke quietly among themselves about the stone. It had taken several men to seal the tomb, and none of them knew how they would move it. The question lingered between them as they walked through the early morning shadows. Then the garden came into view. The stone was already rolled away. Mary's heart surged with confusion and fear. Her first thought was not resurrection. It was loss. She believed someone had taken the body. Without entering the tomb, she turned and ran back toward the city, her breath breaking with urgency as she searched for the disciples. Peter and John listened in disbelief as she told them the tomb was open. Without waiting, they ran toward the garden, racing through narrow streets and open pathways until the tomb appeared before them. John reached it first, but hesitated at the entrance. Peter pushed past him and stepped inside. The dim light revealed the burial cloths lying where the body had been placed. The linen wrappings rested collapsed in their shape, as though the body within them had simply passed through them. The cloth that had covered Jesus' head lay folded and set apart. The tomb was empty. The two men stood in silence, trying to understand what their eyes were telling them. Nothing in their experience prepared them for what they saw. After a moment, they left the tomb and returned toward the city, their thoughts tangled between confusion and fragile hope. Mary remained behind. Grief pulled her back toward the entrance of the tomb. Tears blurred her vision as she leaned forward and looked inside. Where the body had once rested, two figures now sat, one at the head and one at the foot of the burial place. Their presence startled her, yet her sorrow overshadowed fear. They asked why she was weeping. Through her tears, she answered that someone had taken her Lord and she did not know where he had been placed. Turning away from the tomb, she noticed a man standing nearby in the garden. She assumed he was the caretaker of the grounds. Through trembling breath, she asked him if he had moved the body. If he had, she begged him to tell her where it had been taken so she could care for it. The man spoke a single word, her name. The voice carried a familiarity that pierced through her grief instantly. She lifted her eyes fully and recognized him. Jesus stood before her, alive, speaking gently, calming her panic, and instructing her to carry the news to the others. Mary ran from the garden, her grief transformed into urgency. She found the disciples and declared what she had seen. The words felt impossible even as she spoke them. Some listened in stunned silence. Others struggled to believe her story. Later that same day, 2 followers left Jerusalem and walked toward a village called Emmaus. Their steps were slow, their conversation heavy with confusion. They spoke openly about the crucifixion, about the rumors of the empty tomb, and about the shattered expectations that followed Jesus' death. As they walked, a stranger joined them on the road. He asked what they were discussing so intensely. Surprised that he seemed unaware of the events that had consumed Jerusalem, they explained everything. The arrest, the crucifixion, the reports of the empty tomb. Their voices carried disappointment and exhaustion. They had believed Jesus would redeem Israel, but now they spoke as though that hope had collapsed. The stranger listened carefully and then began explaining the scriptures to them, connecting passages they had heard since childhood with events they had just witnessed. As he spoke, something stirred inside them. Not clarity, not full understanding, but a quiet warmth that pulled their attention deeper into his words. By evening, they reached the village and invited the stranger to share a meal with them. As they sat together, he took bread, blessed it, and broke it. In that moment, recognition flooded them. They realized they were sitting with Jesus. Before they could speak, he vanished from their sight. The 2 men stared at one another in stunned silence before rushing back toward Jerusalem, their exhaustion forgotten. They found the disciples gathered together, voices rising in confusion and fear as they shared what had happened on the road. While they spoke, the room suddenly fell silent. Jesus stood among them. The doors remained locked. No footsteps had approached. He simply appeared, calm and steady, speaking the first words they needed to hear. Peace. He showed them his hands and his side, the wounds still visible, undeniable proof that the one standing before them was the same one who had been crucified. Shock slowly gave way to overwhelming joy. Yet even in that joy, questions remained. The story they believed had ended in death now stood alive before them, reshaping everything they thought they understood about life, hope, and the future. And this was only the beginning. The room remained silent long after Jesus first appeared among them. The disciples stood frozen, trying to understand whether what they were seeing was real or a dream born from grief and exhaustion. Fear still clung to them, even as hope tried to rise. Jesus spoke gently, reassuring them that he was not a spirit or illusion. He invited them closer. He showed them his hands and his side, the wounds still visible. The marks of crucifixion had not disappeared. They remained as living testimony to what he had endured and overcome. Some approached cautiously, afraid that if they moved too quickly, the moment might vanish. Others wept openly, overwhelmed by relief they could barely process. To calm their uncertainty, Jesus asked if they had food. They offered him bread and fish, and he ate with them as they watched. The simple act shattered their last doubts. He was alive, fully present, fully real, but one of them was missing. Thomas had not been with them when Jesus first appeared. When the others told him what they had seen, he struggled to believe them. The crucifixion had crushed his expectations, and hope felt too dangerous to accept again. He spoke honestly, saying that he would not believe unless he could see and touch the wounds himself. Days passed. The disciples gathered again in the same room, doors locked as before. This time, Thomas was with them. Without warning, Jesus appeared once more. The air in the room seemed to still as he stepped forward and spoke directly to Thomas, inviting him to see and touch the wounds he demanded to examine. Thomas did not need to touch them. The sight alone overwhelmed him. He fell into confession, declaring Jesus as his Lord and his God. There was no rebuke in Jesus' response, only a quiet reminder that belief born without physical proof would one day become the faith carried by countless others. Over the following weeks, Jesus appeared to his followers again and again. These meetings were not hurried or chaotic. They unfolded with purpose, allowing the disciples to rebuild understanding that had been shattered by the cross. He walked with them along familiar roads. He spoke with them beside the Sea of Galilee, where many of them had first followed him years earlier. There, as fishermen prepared nets in the early morning mist, they saw him standing on the shoreline. At first, they did not recognize him, but when he called out instructions that filled their nets with fish, recognition spread through them like sunrise breaking through darkness. They came ashore, and he prepared a simple meal over a fire. The quiet moment carried deeper meaning than any speech. Around that fire, Jesus restored Peter, the disciple who had denied him 3 times before the crucifixion. With calm patience, Jesus asked Peter 3 times whether he loved him. Each answer rebuilt what guilt had broken. Each response gave Peter a new responsibility, to care for those who would follow after them. These encounters stretched across 40 days. During that time, Jesus spoke about the kingdom of God, not as a distant promise, but as a reality beginning to unfold through the lives of those who believed. He explained scriptures they had heard since childhood, revealing connections they had never fully understood before. Passages that once seemed mysterious now formed a single story that pointed directly toward what they had witnessed. The disciples slowly transformed. Fear gave way to courage. Confusion turned into clarity. The men and women who once hid behind locked doors began preparing for a mission that would carry them far beyond Jerusalem. One final gathering brought them to a hillside outside the city. The air was calm, the sky open and clear above them. Jesus spoke with authority and tenderness, telling them that all authority in heaven and on earth had now been given to him. He instructed them to carry his message to all nations, teaching, baptizing, and continuing the work he had begun. The words felt enormous, almost overwhelming. They were fishermen, tax collectors, ordinary men and women. Yet he spoke to them as though the future of the world would move through their voices. Then, as they watched, something began to change. Jesus lifted his hands in blessing. Slowly, he was raised from the ground, lifted upward until distance and light began to hide him from their sight. They stood staring into the sky long after he disappeared, struggling to accept that he had left them again. Two figures appeared beside them, reminding them that they should not stand frozen in amazement. The story was not ending. One day, they were told, he would return, but first they were to wait. The disciples returned to Jerusalem carrying both awe and uncertainty. They gathered together in prayer, waiting as they had been instructed, not knowing what would happen next or when it would come. 10 days passed. The city filled once more with visitors arriving for the festival of Pentecost. Jerusalem buzzed with voices from distant regions, languages mixing in markets and courtyards. Inside a house where the disciples gathered, quiet prayers filled the air. Then suddenly, the stillness shattered. A sound like a rushing wind roared through the room, though no doors or windows were open. Flames of light appeared above each person gathered there, resting gently yet burning with brilliant clarity. Fear dissolved instantly. Confusion vanished. A deep certainty filled them, replacing hesitation with courage they had never known. They began speaking in languages they had never learned, voices rising in praise that spilled into the streets. Crowds gathered quickly, drawn by the sound and the astonishing sight of ordinary people speaking words understood by visitors from many nations. Peter stepped forward, the same man who once denied Jesus in fear. Now his voice carried strength and conviction. He told the crowd that what they were witnessing was the fulfillment of ancient promises. He declared openly that Jesus, who had been crucified, had been raised to life by God. And he told them that he and the others standing beside him were witnesses to that truth. The crowd listened in stunned silence. Some questioned, some resisted, but many felt something awaken inside them. That day, thousands chose to believe. Thousands chose to follow the message carried by those who had once hidden in fear. From that moment, the story spread beyond Jerusalem. It traveled through villages, across deserts, into cities ruled by empires that had never heard the name of Jesus before. The disciples who once feared arrest now spoke openly, even when it cost them safety, comfort, and eventually their lives. The tomb that once held a body became a symbol of something greater than survival. It became a declaration that death itself no longer held absolute authority. The resurrection did not remain a single moment locked in history. It became a living force moving through generations, shaping faith, inspiring courage, and transforming countless lives. Years passed. Empires rose and fell. Cities changed. Cultures shifted. But the story that began on a hill outside Jerusalem continued to echo through time. It survived persecution, distance, and doubt. It crossed languages and borders, carried by those who believed they had witnessed something that changed the meaning of life and death forever. And at the center of that story stands a tomb that remains empty, a reminder that what seemed like the end became the beginning of a movement that would reach the farthest corners of the world. The cross had not been the final chapter. The silence of the tomb had not been defeat. The morning of resurrection had become a turning point in history that continues to call each generation to listen, to question, and to decide what they believe about the man who walked out of death and changed the story of humanity forever.